right, so we're going to get into The Punisher number 14. This was on sale August 16th, 1988. Written by Mike Barron, penciled by Whilce Portacio, inked by Scott Williams, lettered by Kenneth Bruzenak, and colored by Glynis Ween Oliver. So before we get into things, let me give you a little rundown of the characters here. Of course, we want to have the Punisher. He's definitely involved in this issue. We have Winston Piper, a 29-year-old career criminal who looks young enough to blend in with high school students. He's using the school as a hiding place and has ties to the Kingpin. A young lady by the name of Roxanne, one of Frank's students. She's intelligent, interested in actually learning, and stands out from a lot of the chaos going on around her. There's also McDowell, another student in Frank's class. He's eager to help, maybe a little too eager, and represents just how dangerous and out of control things have gotten at this school. There's Kelton Rhodes, a student connected to the tougher crowd of the school. He's armed and apparently involved with the gang activity Frank is investigating. There's also going to be the appearance of one of the regular faculty members at the school who also gets drawn into Frank's investigation and tries to help, despite Frank very much preferring to work alone. And then, finally, there's the Kingpin. Wilson Fisk doesn't really step onto the stage personally here, but his influence hangs over the entire story. Matter of fact, it's on the cover. Kingpin rules. Frank's investigation begins because he has evidence connecting Kingpin to gang activity inside the school. Let's get into what happens in the issue. So the title of this story is Social Studies. Frank Castle's latest war takes him to someplace a little unusual. A high school classroom. His target is Winston Piper, a 29-year-old career criminal who's managed to disappear into the chaos of the school by passing himself off as a student. Piper has ties to the Kingpin, and Frank has reason to believe he's using the school as a base of operations. So Frank does what Frank Castle apparently does when he needs to infiltrate a high school. He becomes a substitute teacher. Using the name Mr. Melchior, Frank walks into a social studies class that is already completely out of control. Students are fighting, threatening faculty, carrying weapons, and generally treating the classroom like their own private clubhouse. Frank immediately establishes that he is not going to run the class like an ordinary substitute. When one student challenges him with a knife, Frank disarms him, beats him down, and throws him right out of a window. With that little demonstration out of the way, the rest of the class begins to understand that their new teacher might be slightly different from the ones they're used to. Frank continues taking attendance, trying to locate Winston Piper while getting a sense of the students around him. One of them, a young woman named Roxanne, actually seems interested in learning, and Frank begins discussing the social contract with her and the rest of the class. The lesson is interrupted when an armed gang member comes looking for a student named Kelton Rhodes. Frank allows Kelton to leave, but quickly realizes that whatever is happening at the school is much bigger than some unruly teenagers. He leaves Roxanne in charge of the class and begins investigating. Along the way, Frank takes a gun away from another student, McDowell, who enthusiastically offers to help him. Frank ends up finding kids doing drugs in a utility closet and eventually makes his way toward the basement, despite another teacher warning him that a gang has basically taken over the area. Frank discovers that Winston Piper really is living underneath the school. And more importantly, Piper's operation just isn't dealing drugs. Frank overhears Piper and his associates discussing a payment of $1.5 million from Libya in exchange for blowing up the school. The gang still intends to get approval from the Kingpin, which confirms that Frank has stumbled into something considerably larger than what he expected. While Frank watches from hiding, his thoughts briefly turn to his own son. Had his family survived, his son would now be around the same age as the students Frank is dealing with. Unfortunately, Frank's backup arrives in the form of exactly the people he does not want helping him: McDowell and another one of the teachers. Their arrival gives away Frank's position. Gunfire erupts and Frank kills one of Piper's armed men. Winston orders his people to retreat and escapes into the sewer beneath the school. Frank makes it very clear that he wants the teacher and McDowell nowhere near the fighting. When they refuse to listen, Frank settles the argument physically, dropping the teacher and kicking McDowell, before ordering them both back upstairs to wait for the police. He then goes after Piper alone. Before heading into the sewers, Frank stops back at the classroom and tells Roxanne to keep the lesson going until he returns. Once back underground, Frank reflects on the Kingpin and his long-running war with Daredevil. Frank knows he has information taken from the Kingpin's own files, and realizes that sooner or later Wilson Fisk is going to become very interested in exactly who has been interfering with his operations. Frank eventually catches up with Winston and the remaining gang members, but something unusual happens. Rather than simply killing everyone, Frank decides to use rubber bullets and a concussion grenade, reasoning that many of the people involved are still kids. Frank actually catches himself wondering whether he's going soft here. The grenade scatters Piper's group, and Winston falls into the rushing sewer water. He desperately calls for help as the current pulls him away, but Frank makes no attempt to save him. Another young gang member tries to attack Frank from behind, but Frank easily knocks him down. And instead of killing him, Frank gives him a choice. Get out of the sewer, go back to school, learn to read and write, become a regular citizen. Or, the next time Frank sees him, he'll kill him. Once again, Frank wonders if he's going soft. With the immediate threat eliminated, Frank returns to the classroom as though nothing particularly unusual has happened. Roxanne is still teaching. Frank takes control of the class again, and afterward he talks with her about her future. She tells him she's graduating soon and wants to attend college, but doesn't really know how to get started. Frank tells her to begin preparing for the PSAT, and to her surprise, announces that he intends to come back to school the next day. Roxanne warns him that Kelton and his gang are probably going to try to kill him. But Frank's response? Teaching is his life. He isn't going to let a couple of punks stop him. And just as Frank is leaving, McDowell catches up with him and asks for his guns that Frank borrowed earlier. Frank tells him, well, they were destroyed. McDowell complains that he paid a lot of money for those. Frank stops, looks at him, and he asks, how much? And that's where we end it, The Punisher number 14. Alright, so my thoughts on the book, my thoughts on this issue, social studies. I like this issue. I don't think it's one of the absolute best Punisher stories we've had so far, but I do like the gimmick here. I like the idea of Frank Castle going into a high school and pretending to be a substitute teacher. And yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. I mean, come on. Frank Castle as a social studies teacher. But with this school, I can kind of buy it. This place is a disaster. These kids are carrying guns, knives, they're doing drugs in utility closets, they're threatening teachers. I mean, the bar to get somebody into this classroom is probably pretty low. And they're probably just happy somebody showed up. And I think that's really where the fun of the issue is, for me. It's not really Winston Piper or the terrorism plot. It's Frank dealing with these kids. You know, he walks into the classroom and immediately he's got this giant kid testing him. This dude looks like the biggest guy in the room, probably the biggest troublemaker in the room, and Frank makes an example out of him. He takes him down, throws him out the window, literally throwing him out of the school. And I kind of love that because Frank is making a statement. He's saying, okay, whatever rules you guys had before, those are over. Mr. Melchior is here now. Now, is this school over the top? Absolutely. I mean, this feels like one of those late 80s movie versions or a music video version of a horrible inner city high school where every single person has a weapon and nobody has any control over anything. It's exaggerated and ridiculous, but it fits the story they're trying to tell. Where I think the issue starts to lose me a little bit is Winston Piper. Okay, Winston, specifically 29 years old, but supposedly he looks young enough to pass for a high school student. Fine. Okay, I'll go with it. But he's not really much of a villain. We don't get a lot from him. He doesn't really challenge Frank. He doesn't go one-on-one with him. He's basically there because Mike Baron needed a reason to get Frank into the school. And then the plot gets kind of weird. But based on this cover, I thought we were getting a drug story. We've got this young girl who looks like she overdosed, pills all over the place, Frank holding her, and behind them you've got Kingpin rules spray painted on the lockers. That cover tells me, okay, drugs are getting into this school, Kingpin is involved somehow, Frank's pissed, and he's going to go clean this up. That's not really a story we get, though. Instead, we get Libyans paying these guys $1.5 million to blow up the school? And I'm sitting here going, okay, why? I mean, Winston is using the school as his headquarters. Why are you blowing up your own headquarters? What exactly is the Kingpin's part in all of this? I don't know. It's strange. It's a strange plot. Honestly, I would have rather had the story that the cover was trying to sell to me. Now, the Kingpin stuff I do like. That part works for me because you can feel Frank getting closer and closer to Wilson Fisk. Frank is starting to poke around in things connected to the Kingpin. He knows things that Kingpin probably doesn't want him knowing, and eventually these two are going to cross paths. And I'm looking forward to that. I also like the Daredevil reference, Frank calling Daredevil a liberal wimp, but also admitting that he respects him. That's pretty funny. That feels like Frank, and it's kind of interesting because Frank spends his entire issue doing something that Daredevil would probably approve of. He gives people second chances. Frank says a couple of times that he thinks he's getting soft. I mean, I don't think he's getting soft. I think he understands these are kids. There's a difference between some hardened criminal who has murdered a bunch of people and a teenager who's making terrible decisions. Frank hasn't decided that these kids have crossed that line yet. And that's important with Frank. There's a line. Once you cross it, once Frank decides you're done, you're done. These kids aren't there yet. And I think the moment where he thinks about his son helps support that. His son would have been around the same age as these kids. Frank knows kids screw up. They do stupid things, and if there's still a chance that one of them can get out of this life, he's willing to give them that chance. That's why he uses rubber bullets. That's why he lets the kid go in the sewer and basically tells him go back to school, learn how to read and become a normal citizen, or I'll kill you. Which is a very Frank Castle version of career counseling, I guess. Roxanne I like too. She's kind of a shining light in the classroom. She's actually there to learn. She wants to go to college. She's trying to do something better with herself while all this insanity is going on around her. And Frank notices that. He actually seems interested in helping her. And when we get to the ending and she asks if Frank is coming back tomorrow, and Frank says yes. Really, Frank? You're coming back tomorrow? Why? Your mission's over. Winston's gone. He basically flushed a guy down the sewer. There's no reason for him to come back and teach social studies tomorrow. So the only thing I can figure is Frank actually got something out of this. Maybe he thinks he did some good, or maybe he liked helping the kids out. Maybe somewhere in there Frank Castle actually enjoys being a teacher. Now let's not go too far with that because Frank barely taught anything. He came in, he threw a kid out the window, took some guns away from another kid, left Roxanne in charge, went into the basement, shot some people, went into the sewer, and then came back. So no, I'm not going to call Frank Castle Teacher of the Year here. Roxanne probably did more teaching than he did. But I like that Frank wants to come back. That says something about him. Overall, I think this is a good issue. I don't think it's top 5 for me out of the first 14 issues. It's probably somewhere around 6, 7, 8, something like that. The villain isn't memorable. The terrorism plot is weird. The cover promises me a story I think I would have liked more than the one I got. But the gimmick works. Frank Castle as a substitute teacher is fun. That's the thing I remember about this issue. That and the cover. Because this might be my favorite cover of the series so far. So yeah, The Punisher number 14, Social Studies, strange issue, fun issue, and probably a better story about Frank Castle dealing with a classroom full of kids than it is a story about Winston Piper and international terrorism.